So let me introduce Ralph Cummins. Ralph is an ISBM practice fellow, and he's president and CMO of the EMM Group, a marketing excellence firm that deploys the best practices of strategic marketing to help their clients develop a winning growth strategy and the capabilities to repeat it. Over his diverse career, Ralph has been a management consultant, a global brand leader, and an agency executive. And through it all, he's been an advocate for building strong brands to differentiate and drive business growth. In this presentation, he's going to review the common internal and external sources of marketing risk, introduce a simple framework for assessing risk across several dimensions, and discuss actions that you can take to eliminate the risks so you can focus on managing the real risks. Ralph?
Thanks, Lynn. First, I want to start off by thanking Lynn and Rand, who's not here at the moment, and of course Lori for herding the cats and getting us from here to there and everywhere else, because it's not an easy task to manage a group this size, particularly in a foreign location for a one-time only event. So thank you very much. One of the design ideas behind this conference, if you haven't figured it out already, is the idea that the different presenters can sort of bounce ideas off each other and relate to each other, riff on each other, right? Which it should be obvious that that's what we're doing at this point. From my perspective, when I learned about this and I saw where my place was in the lineup, it was a little intimidating to follow Luciano and follow David and follow JT and the other speakers yesterday. We were supposed to sort of wear our university credentials. So I'm an Amherst College grad and I'm an English literature major. And I'm probably better suited to talk about the relationship between Shakespeare and Marlowe than I am to talk about marketing, which is what I'm actually studying right now. It's fascinating, but that's a whole different story, right? In fact, if you want to have that conversation, we'll have that later, right? But so what I know about marketing and marketing risk management is completely born out of experience. Well, and so now here's where I try to risk. By the way, I've gone to all the other folks and said, please add whatever you want to what I'm saying, right? Kind of thing. Because even though it's intimidating to follow these very, very smart people, the truth is all the framing that we've heard from the different speakers can be applied to what I'm about to talk about. Right? And what I'm about to talk about is I'm either going to bring this to a crash landing, but I would like to think that I'm going to bring all this great thinking down to a very, very practical place, which is the actual act of managing risk in marketing as a marketer in real time, right? So not trying to think about external risk, not trying to worry about the investment risk up front, but actually the ongoing risk of just doing marketing, right? Which is very present at all times for people. And how can you do a better job managing that, right? And I'm going to talk, somebody earlier said that all risk is personal, right? So everything that I'm going to tell you, it learned out of my personal experience, and most of the stories are about my personal experience and how I encountered risk, right? EMM, many of you know who we are. We've been around for a very long time now. We were founded by Procter & Gamble and Accenture way back in 1998 as a way for Procter & Gamble to monetize their IP when they were worrying about, at a time, think about 1998, they were in the deodorant and suds business and everybody else was getting into the internet business. And they're thinking, how do we succeed in the 21st century? So they went down this path of trying to monetize their IP for growth. Laughley came in and had something different to say about that. And we know how that story ended, right? So in 2002, the ASP platform, there's a reg, you gotta go back to know what that means, right? The ASP platform we created using Procter & Gamble's intellectual property, they decided to pull that back inside and eliminate the joint venture, which was actually called Imperative, EMM Imperative, Enterprise Marketing Management. That's what the EMM stands for. And do we do that? Sorta, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. That's the beauty of branding. But that's where this all started, right? And so ever since then, since 2003, we have been a consultant focused on strategic growth issues using the best practice of marketing. And that's what we do for people in this room and other folks. This idea of marketing risk management is an interesting one to me because it came from actually Rand we worked on the DuPont Marketing Excellence Program together for 7 years, along with Ralph and other folks from ISBM. That's how I met the ISBM folks. And I don't know, it might have been like year 1 or 2 of that program. I was feeling this, and Rand came to us and said, you know, a lot of the people that are now being asked to sit in judgment of these marketing plans and stuff are struggling with the idea of the risk behind that. And I do remember, it was funny because when Dave was talking to this, Bill from DPT, Bill Weber, I remember this guy came to me and he said, you know, you guys got to do a better job teaching us how to kill things so we know that we're investing in the right things and not not investing in the wrong things. And I just remember thinking to myself, like what David just said was like took me right back to that moment, because they couldn't kill anything, right? They were so risk adverse that they would take on everything. It was a very interesting time. But anyway, this idea of marketing risk management came up as something we needed to do. And so we said, how do we do that, right? And so what I'm going to share with you today is sort of the background about how we think about market risk management and the framework that we developed back in, I think, 2010, 2011, something like that. And we have been using our practice ever since. It's very straightforward. And by the way, if you like to take notes, I'm flattered, but I will give you everything and then some after this if you want it. So anyway, so all risk is personal. Just have a look at this, okay? Am I to understand that my proposal is greeted with some skepticism, okay? So I was at that meeting. I'm the guy in the black coat. That is the leadership team for Genworth Financial, and this is 2006, right? And when Genworth Financial was spun off from GE, the largest IPO in American history, because it was a $15 billion company, right? And we had a very loud and celebrated public launch of the brand, featured Andre Agassi, and Steffi Graf, spent a lot of money. And I was tasked with launching in Europe. And so a year later, I brought in my European brand marketing launch plan and presented it to the leadership team at Genworth Financial. And I was so excited about it because it really kind of mimicked what we've done in the US. And so it didn't feel particularly risky to me. You know, in fact, I thought it was pretty smart, really made sense strategically on all levels, and worked on it for a year and all this stuff, and had a big price tag to it. It was it was a lot of money. So the CEO, when I got done with the presentation, I had other people there. He looked at me and very politely said, well, that was a very interesting and provocative proposal. We'll get back to you, right? And I was just crushed. And I went to my boss and I said, God, I mean, I said, I thought I had like pre-sold this to half the people that were like laugh. They didn't laugh. What they did is as soon as you were done, they were looking at their phones. Like you were like, oh my God, you knew you were toast, right? Like there's nobody in the room that had a question. And I said, I don't get it. I said, I thought that we had this thing all figured out. And he said, you missed one point. He said, when we did the launch out of GE, we were spending their money. He said, you're spending our money. I was like, oh, so that's the problem, right? So that's the first time I think I ever really felt the fact that I was the risk. I, the marketer, the lead marketer, was the risk, right? And so that was my own personal tussle with marketing risk management. And then I got to think about it as a consulting years later. So what I learned from that is this: leaders that are setting in judgment, and this is not just marketing, this is certainly marketing, right? And particularly in a B2B industrial context where maybe marketing it doesn't feel as essential or as important to people, right? But leaders are risk managers, right? Everything David told you, everything everybody else told you, they're risk, that's what they're doing, right? And they're measuring the financial risk because their job is to try to protect and enhance shareholder value, whether that's private shareholders or public shareholders, right? And everything they do is managing a portfolio of investments, right? Does that make sense? That's essentially what they're doing. I never thought about it this way, right? And so they're looking at every plan and like, you know, is this going to add to our shareholder value? Is it going to destroy shareholder value, right? And I don't think until that day that I really understood that, right? And what I didn't realize that day, and I realize now, is that we can't eliminate risk, right? Risk is real, risk is out there every day, but we can demonstrate that we understand it. And we are going to accept certain risks and not other risks, right? And in doing that, I think that we have a chance to actually succeed and make people feel more confident, right, in what we're doing. So that was my own lesson. And I've asked myself all the time, what is risky about marketing, right? What is risky about marketing? Anybody got any thoughts on that idea?
It can hurt your brand.
What's that?
It can hurt your brand.
Hurt your brand? What else?
The price volume trade-off.
Price volume trade-off, yeah. What other thing, what else is risky about marketing?
Are you targeting the right customers?
Targeting the right customers, yeah. What else? I mean, there's a lot of answers to this question,
Yeah.
right? Right. So I'm gonna give you an answer that you're not thinking about, okay? This is what's risky about marketing. Blimps. Blimps are a big problem, okay? But blimps are a great metaphor for one of the greatest causes of risk in marketing, right? Does anybody remember Bigfoot pizza? Probably don't. Here's why you should remember Bigfoot pizza. Bigfoot pizza was the fastest brand to $1 billion in America. True story. Pizza Hut launched Bigfoot in 1994. And go back in time and go back in the history of the pizza wars, right? Pizza Hut kind of invented franchise pizza. You went to the Red Roof, you got takeout, you either ate there, you took it out. Domino's comes along, invents delivery, gets a big part of that market. Pizza Hut fought back very valiantly and regained leadership in the delivery market in the late 90s. And then this thing called Little Caesar comes along. And so Pizza Hut saw this competitive threat for Little Caesars. You can teach everything about risk management marketing just using this case, but I'm not going to do that. But they've had to blunt Little Caesars, right? Because it took them a lot of money to catch up to Domino's, and this time they weren't going to get fooled. And so they began internally it was almost cultish in the way it went down, right? You had to get on board with the Pizza Hut launch. And I ran the Western Division, and I had all the Western Division people were new. Pizza Hut never was west of the Rockies until the late 80s. And so these people just got done this whole delivery battle, and win this delivery battle, and then all of a sudden they were told that I can't remember what the exact capital expenditure was, but to do this, you had to buy a new oven. So there was massive financial risk, right? And they had to get everybody on board so that the national advertising made sense. And it was like the closest thing to like a religious, campaign I've ever been involved in. And it got super, super contentious, right? If you weren't on board, right? And we were BBO, we were the corporate ad agency. We were supposed to be on board, and everybody in the West Division hated the idea, right? What happened with Bigfoot was extremely successful, right? They just spent, though, 5 years convincing you to spend $19.99 for a medium 2-topping pizza with a free liter of Diet Pepsi or whatever. And now they turned around and said, you can get a pizza twice that big and a liter of Diet Pepsi for $12.99. And that thing tasted like death. The cardboard box that came in tasted better. Right? So but if you were a loyal Pizza Hut person dropping $20 every Friday night, you tried this thing. The trial was unbelievable, and they completely tanked the Pizza Hut brand. It hit $1 billion, and then it started going down. It is one of the main reasons that PepsiCo rolled out the restaurants young. They were like, I can't take this restaurant stuff, right? People buy soda all day long. These people just build this brand, right? It was incredible. And the metaphor for the bomb of Bigfoot, right? The brand bomb. I mean, you talk about a risk that you said it, destroyed brand value. Oh my God, it was unbelievable how much brand value this destroyed. The big marketing idea was the blimp, okay? And so the Pizza Hut blimp, the Bigfoot blimp, was going to start in Seattle and go around the edge of the country and end up in New York at right around July 4th, okay? But you had to pay for it to come fly over your DMA or your city. Okay? And some franchises would, right? And the San Francisco franchise would not pay for it. So when they came down the coast, they diverted out over Sacramento. where the rudder got stuck and it went around in circles or over Sacramento for hours. They got like extra, value for that thing. And they got it fixed somehow, and it happened again over LA. So the journey of the Bigfoot blimp was fraught with peril. And it crashed on a building in New York City, which might have been the greatest thing that ever happened. Right. So on July 4th, 1993, the Bigfoot blimp came down on 55th Street on the Upper East Side, scaring, and nobody got hurt, but scaring the bejesus out of people. And those people came out to see that blimp draped over their building, right? And so that was a metaphor for the ignorance of risk that happened there. And this whole thing was a case of hubris, right? Leadership bias, you name it, like every bias, which is obviously a big part of any kind of risk that we talked about here. So that was a cautionary tale for me that I took forward. Here's another one, not quite as dramatic, but I like this one. So I said blimps, big platforms. That's another one. I hate platforms, right? So just read that for a second, okay? I don't even think I have to tell you what's wrong with this picture, right? The digital industrial company. First, think about what David was just telling us, right? GE for GE, right? GE for customers, right? GE for the world, right? A $15 billion software business by 2020, right? So GE had great success developing very specific software applications for various parts of their business. And we were involved with them at that time. And we knew about this, right? But somebody got the idea. Somebody added up, said, we're one of the largest software companies in the world. Digitization's happening. Let's become an industrial software company, right? And you know what happened at the end of this. I have to tell you about the end of this story. But the first time you saw that slide, you should have gone, oh my, look at this, right? They spent $6 billion on this. And it was a disastrous shuttering failure. And there were so many points in this process where they could have said, wait, we're not a software company, right? Let me think of all the reasons why we probably could have had really good software businesses still without deciding that we're going to be the digital industry, right? So that leads me to the go.
Sorry, can I ask a question? Coming from the software industry, why did it fail? Because coming from the software industry, I look at this and say, pretty good idea. and I would argue and say, look at the car industry. They say it's a computer on wheels now. And being a software company having a consistent platform, why did it fail?
So somebody far smarter than me would have to tell you that, and we weren't involved in the time that this was happening. We were involved right up to the point where they started doing this. Well, for one thing, I think for a lot of the reasons that people talked about before, but this idea of desirability, the fact that you were able to sell software as on the backside of the other products and services that you sold made perfect sense, right? But it doesn't mean that I want to go buy software for you for, a wider variety of things, right? So that made sense, it made sense. So there was no real need for this beyond the products and services that GE had, right? So there was this false positive that we can be a software company because we actually have sold software as part of our products and services, right? And they were getting revenue for software, right? They actually had a pretty good business. But this was all of a sudden reversing their paradigm from software is the lead and everything else is secondary. So, that's one reason, right? I'm pretty sure that most of the customers didn't say, well, I'm not sure I think of you as a software, you as a, data management or industrial management company and other things. But so it was just a misunderstanding of the extrapolation of need. But once it got going, once it got momentum, if anybody that worked in GE, once an idea got out of the pin and people started getting behind it, you were either in or you weren't, right? And if you weren't in, you weren't part of the tribe. So anyhow, that's another one. Platforms are, to me, that's a way of labeling something because you can't really explain what the value is anyway. I asked what, this whole thing about, I did, by the way, I consulted AI and I asked them what marketing risk is. And this is what they told me, right? Brand reputation risk, legal risk, financial risk, trust risk, competitive timing risk, cultural and audience risk, right? So in other words, pretty much everything, right? And this kind of makes sense. And this is like the point that, like, I as a marketer think that you sort of have to start from this perspective if you want to be really good and about this, which is marketing is investment in growth. We all agree on that, right? We cannot predict the future. Yeah, I can't predict the future. We can't predict the future. Therefore, we cannot guarantee a return on marketing. You know, I mean, you can't literally look anybody in the face. You can talk about probability. You can talk about all the reasons why this makes sense and all that. You can make a great case for it, as you should, but you cannot guarantee it, right? And there are other things that you do that you can probably guarantee. Product development. If you sold a product like that for 20 years and you continue get better at it, and you're going to add the next feature to it, I don't think it's as big a risk to say, we've done that before. We'll do it again. We understand the channel, but you're doing something intangible, right? I mean, the brand's intangible, so you can't guarantee that you're going to connect with people in a way that changes their behavior. So it's a financial risk, right? If you can't guarantee it. So therefore, so this is why I bring it back to personal. Therefore, you are a risk, right? And that's what I realized that day in presenting to those people, that I was the risk, right? And I had to deal with that. So, by the way, that's what you get if you Google scary marketer. So I was a scary marketer, right? And so, I said going forward, so I've got to get better at this in my career, and then I've got to help other people get better at it, right? And what it's really about, it's not avoiding risk. This is start from all this is a risk, right? But it's identifying the risk that you want to take and that you accept and that you can manage, right? But also demystifying the idea of risk or getting rid of risks that aren't real, because it's very easy to see risk where there isn't any. And it's also easy to ignore risk, right? So the whole idea is simply to say there is risk there. Let's figure out what's real and what's not real. And let's put together a plan to manage what's real and not. Okay. So if you start there, I think you got a leg up as a man, And by the way, talk about this in the planning. So in a planning context, because planning, just like David talked about it in the in the pre-product development or in the product development process, in marketing, planning is sort of the time to talk about this, right? Because we're about to make some investments, right? And because risk in the market never goes away. Part of your annual planning, you should be assessing the changing nature of risk and simply talking about it, right? So I don't know how many people came to brand packaged goods, but it's pretty in brand packaged goods plans from time immemorial, because they're making big investments up front in building the brand. You always had to have the risk slide right up front. What are the biggest risks of this thing? I was very young and I don't know how the brand managers determined that, but they always did say, here are the risks, right? So, but what is the source of marketing risk, right? It's easy to see. I'm sitting there talking about investment risk. So the way I see it, there are two really important sources of marketing risk, right? One is people, bad news, right? But humans are capable of managing, but also accelerating and exacerbating risk in a very profound way, right? So why do I say people? Okay. There's two aspects. One is talent, right? So talent management. If you're a marketer, that's part of your job. Marketing with all the data and all the science behind it is still a judgment call in a lot of cases, right? And this is where the rubber hits the road. Does anybody remember the United Rising campaign? Yeah. Well, it wasn't out there for long, but it was very much celebrated when it happened, because it was a big celebrity group of creative people that did it, who had a track record of convincing their clients to take big swings, often completely disconnected from the reality of the marketplace. And this is what people said about the Rising campaign: more of a haiku than an ad, not a great look for the world's largest airline. This was supposed to be like getting you to think new about United Airlines, right? Artful, but ultimately mind-numbing, ineffective, and self-indulgent, right? Woefully out of touch with the onboard experience, right? A self-indictment of the hardworking employees. I've got 4 million miles on United Airlines, and I was flying United everywhere when this thing, when that campaign came out, I went like, they have lost their minds. And I knew the creative director because I had worked with him on a campaign that bombed just as bad 2 years ago and at another agency. So talent is an issue that you have to judge, right? And I'm not gonna talk about that, but that is a marketer's obligation because you have to bring in talent, you have to manage that talent, right? And that is a risk. Are you getting the right talent or not? Because you're hiring people that are gonna make judgments on what you should do using all these things we've talked about, right? So I do believe that that's an easy part for me to talk about because I think most of you as managers and leaders would see that as part of your job, right? There's another part of the people thing that's equally difficult, and that's biases, right? So people far smarter than me can talk a lot about human bias and everything, and we all know they're working. The cognitive biases are a huge deal in marketing, right? And they're at work all the time. And you as a marketing manager have to manage the bias of your team, of your cross-functional colleagues, and of your leaders. And I do believe that you also recognize that is part of my job, right? I mean, when I was at Genworth, like anytime there's a leader come to me, we had to have a meeting before the meeting to talk about the leader's bias coming in. I mean, literally talk about what are they coming in prepared to buy, not buy, what's their perspective. We spent an unbelievable, I mean, it was like mind numbing, right? Like it's like I forgot what we were actually in the meeting to do, right? Because we were so obsessed with trying to play to this person's either strength or weakness or everything. So you know that happens, but it's important. Like I was looking at what, you know, when David's speech resonated with me so profoundly because, you know, that getting the idea in front of whether actually it was a good idea, whether it was a market for it or not, is a big problem, right? And that's bias, right? Oh, and at DuPont, I mean, Rand could probably tell stories like cows coming up, right? People get excited about an idea at DuPont. And marketing's job was to find a market for it and create a business case. I mean, I've had people come to me and say, can you create a business case for this idea? I'm like, well, did you start with a business case? Isn't that where you started, right? So that's bias at work. It is always at work. I asked AI about bias, right? And one of the things that came, I love this one. You knew your boss was wrong, but you kept quiet because everyone else agreed. Who has not been at that meeting? Who has not seen that at play, right? When I started Genworth, I was on part of the GE culture. They actually wrote on the outside of my folder and said, break glass. And the CEO told me, he said, you're here to break glass. So I started breaking glass. People hated me, you know, because it's so tribal. Everybody's waiting to see what the leaders would do, you know. And I go, well, if you're not taking a point of view, I got one, right? And they're like, God, kill that guy. You know? Because I would say this, you know, I was a guy that wouldn't keep quiet. You know, I would say, this is not a great thing. And everybody's like, oh my, because when I would present, there'd be no conversation. Everybody would run back to their boss's office and they'd decide whether or not they should agree with me, right? Nobody would ever agree in public about this, right? I love these other ones though, because we all, and I love that. Now I'll give AI some, I actually have a whole presentation on bias, but I'm not going to bore you with. But confirmation bias, we all know what that one is. Do you know what survivorship bias is? Does anybody, I didn't know this. I learned something doing this. Does anybody know what survivorship bias is? It's anytime you have a process of elimination or selection, right? So the things that survive the selection process, there's a bias that they're good ideas and you ignore why the other ideas failed, right? And there was an example that I read about that I thought was really instructive. And I started thinking about how much that's affected my own life. I'm like, oh my God, that's me, right? In World War II, they would study the aircraft that survived where the bullet holes were in them. And they would use that to figure out where the armory should go on the plane. And then somebody said, well, no, it's the ones that didn't survive that you need to figure out what the armory goes to, right? And that brought it to, do you know what anchoring bias is? It's a $100 million market, right? Leader comes in, $100 million market. So we all start from that perspective. And then the debate is about whether or not it's a $100 million market for the next whatever month, right? You know, that's anchoring bias, right? Somebody in a position of influence puts a number on the table that they might have just pulled out of thin air, right? Overconfidence bias, I think we know that one, bandwagon effect. Sunk cost fallacy is one that I, again, cringe when I see that, right? Which is, you know, this is a dog. It is not working. You know, we should stop everything and reinvest in something that actually is working. Oh no, you got to see it through. Got to see the investment through. You know, like the blimp's going to crash into a building. Like, let's pull it down in Houston, right? So that's a big one in marketing, right? You know, oh, you don't what you You don't want to stop now because we might undermine the learnings that are gonna come out of this. It's clearly failing. Nobody's buying it, right? Pull it out of the marketplace. Anyway, those biases are at work and we have to, and we know that, and we have to manage them. So people's part of it. What's the other big source of bias? This is easy. Come on. It's the market. Right? By the way, if you Google scary market, you get that market.
Big source of risk, you mean.
Yeah, big source of risk, sorry, big source of risk, the market. That's the crazy market in Bangkok where the train goes through it, right? And they have the market along the train tracks, so. You know, it's funny the things you learn when you Google stuff like scary market or scary market. So market risk, and this is the part that we can manage, and we can, and everybody can do this, right? That we don't, well, yeah. I would like to suggest you need consultants, but you don't, right? This is a matter of willpower and conviction that is part of my job. So market-based risk, let's talk about this. First market-based risk, is there a market? Now, I know that sounds silly, right? Of course there's a market. Well, I don't know if there is or not, right? So is there a market for my product? And obviously the more you're in the pre-launch phase, the more you're going to be thinking about this. Webvan's one of my favorite ones, $360 million to build their national network of depots, because in 12 months, everybody in America is going to stop going to the grocery store and they're going to start buying from Webvan, right? And anybody with, with half a brain, I lived through the Webvan disaster. I remember when they opened Packville Park, now Merkle Park in San Francisco, all the cup holders were sponsored by Webvan. Everybody's like, who's Webvan, right? And they're delivering drinks to your seats, right? So you get it, we're going to deliver to you kind of thing. We were sending them stuff like, you're trying to get people who maybe their only social outlet is go to the grocery store, right? To stop an ingrained behavior that goes back 100 years. We're sending stuff like, it's like basically riffing on the Got Milk campaign, like a picture of a person with a broken leg, with the question, got Webvan, right? Or a pregnant person got Webvan, that kind of thing. Like, you need to market to the edge and make this thing relevant, right? But they were convinced, Accenture was behind this, all these people, they were convinced there's a huge market here, and that thing failed miserably, right? And the amount of investment behind the feasibility side of it before they even knew there was a market was incredible. That's a good one. This one I'm not sure about. I know that the SAP by design is, it seemed like a good idea. They put a lot of money into it. They're ramping it down now. And again, share risk, right? So that is a risk, right? We cannot presume that either we can capture share or we can retain share in a marketplace over time. And so we always seem to be evaluating that. And then finally, earnings risk. Can we make money and sustain earnings over time? Because that's marketing's job too, right? Our job's not just to launch things, it's to sustain things. And that's I look at AOL. I'm not an expert on AOL, but AOL, after their initial success, seemed to be very good at investing in things that were already moving on. And when there was a declining profit pool and a revenue pool, because other people already come into it, and they sort of innovated themselves into irrelevance, right? And spent a lot of money doing it. Although you can still have an AOL account if you want it. Yes.
Just to give you some insights. I've been at SAP for a long time. The SAP by design topic has cost the company $1 billion.
How much?
$1 billion.
Wow.
$1 billion to how much revenue?
No, they lost on the whole thing.
They've lost $1 billion. Why? What I've read about it, it sort of made sense. What did they not get?
They didn't listen to the market. They developed a product in the basement.
So back to David's point, right? So, right, okay. So there's three sources of market-based risk, right? It's out there. So the question is, where is it and how do we manage it? All right. So we actively develop and manage people in real time. So the talent part of this and the bias part of this is part of your managing process, a marketer. But the market-based risk is a different process where we have to analyze and understand the risk, then decide what we accept and what we can mitigate. All right. So begin with the idea that natural risk exists. There's three sources of that risk. And then add to that the idea of how you as a marketer, your behavior can add or reduce that risk, right? And to the extent that you are willing to accept, but then and also reduce risk, I think the people's confidence in you goes up. you can't ignore bias. You have to be the person, right? So earlier in the, before you go to market, you hopefully your development people are doing what David said and not ignoring biases, right? That's why I was interested in the whole we believe thing, how do you avoid bias and that kind of thing. You've got to have a rigorous planning process that gives you a chance to think about this stuff. And if you're lazy and not disciplined about this, then you won't get the forum in which you can have this conversation. And then once you do this, you do need to present a contingency plan and that's, I talked to Luciano about that yesterday. He kind of went down the different mitigation strategies that you have. We can do a whole nother seminar on contingency planning. I'm not going to talk a lot about this. I'm really going to talk about the first part of this, but you do have to have a plan, and it doesn't have to be grand, but to suggest that you've analyzed the risk and you've accepted it and and you're going to handle it and not be able to say, and this is what I'm going to do is a problem. Because there's confidence comes that you've completed that process, right? So when you think about this, so to make this, I'm going to make this kind of simple. We all know that in the market, risk changes over time with the product life cycle or the market life cycle, right? So there's more market risk when you're new, right? There's more share risk as you're growing, right? You're very successful. Well, what does a successful entry in any market usually garner in a growing market where you're gobbling up share? Usually competition, right? So somebody going to come in and take share away from you. And then as the market begins to mature, can you have earnings risk, right? Now, one of the things that I should say about this whole thing is we developed, and I was thinking about yesterday's conversations, we developed this back in the before the upside down world came, right? So this was back when there was an expectation that we could actually do things in normal time without black swans appearing I think this morning, we had two massive human events last night. Massive earthquake in Venezuela and a huge heat wave in Europe that's literally killing dozens of people, right? We will not be talking about that 24 hours ago. 15 years ago, we'd have been talking about this for a week or two or a month, maybe, right? It just happens that we move on, right? This disruption. So this is the way you wish the world worked, right? But one of the things, the lessons I took from yesterday is that even though I may be in a growing or maturing market as a marketer, I can't ignore the market-based risk because markets get disrupted now, right? So I would, the way I would modify the way I think about this now is I would use my same process, but I might every year say, is there something that might come that even though we've got a nice fat growing business here, that might actually disrupt our market and change the nature of our market? So we were going along just fine. So I'm not sure that that the potential market, the idea that the market exists and I can be in it is a stable concept anymore. Does that make sense? Right? So I think you might have to be a little more thoughtful about whether or not because I used to say, like, look, if you got a mature product, just worry about earnings risk, right? Or if you're in the growth curve, just worry about share risk. Or if you're pre-market, just worry about market risk or this market. Maybe not so much anymore, right? The other thing is that we all know this, but it is important to know, David pointed this out, others have pointed this out, risk rises with newness, right? The more, and we talked about this yesterday, I was really curious about the whole unknown unknowns, how many are there really, right? So when we're in new markets or new adjacencies or new customers and we're doing new products, the risk is amplified, right? And we all know that. The question is, do our plans reflect our knowledge of that, right? Do we ask all the right questions? Like, I like the development process that David said, because he's basically saying, like, let's try to de-risk this by answering these questions up front. I'm not sure they're all answered properly. But even once you're in the market and you're still new, things can change fast, right? So you have to have sort of a heightened sensitivity to risk when you're new, right? So here's the framework, right? And I can give you all the detail on this. When we went to develop this, right, we didn't make this a valuable false. We asked ourselves a question. We said, who is really invested in understanding the nature of risk over the long term in advance of any kind of investment? And the conclusion we reached was the pharmaceutical industry. You think about the way the pharmaceutical industry works. And so we actually did research, and this is as close as I came to being able to like hold my own with a really smart academic person, in that I went and met with the academics that created this for the pharmaceutical industry, right? And walked away realizing how limited my intellectual capability was. But I was able to understand this, and we licensed this more or less, and we evolved it for marketing. So 5 risk factors early on, right? Is there a product category? That's, people go, what do you mean? Of course there is. Well, okay, fine. You know, we have a way of answering that question. You know, is there a market for that product? Is there sales volume you can think about? You know, can you forecast it, right? And I've applied this many times. Of course we can. I said, where you want to put a forecast into the system? No. So the answer is no, we can't forecast it, right? Oh, we can guess at it. Like I said, can you forecast it? And then of course, pricing risk, right? Make all kinds of assumptions about pricing. The market says, yeah, I'll buy that for about half of what you said. Then we get into share risk factors, right? The target market, right? You know, have I defined a market too widely that I can actually have a value proposition that makes sense for the target? Of course, the biggest risk of all is trying to be all things to all people, right? And then you dumb down the whole thing. Same with the value proposition risk. Can I be relevant across all segments or one segment, right? SWOT risk, that's a big one. You know, often overlooked. Am I leveraging the company's strengths? Or am I actually leaning into weaknesses? It doesn't mean because you're leaning into weaknesses, you shouldn't do it, because that's how companies get better. But you need to know that, because that's a risk, right? That, you know, up front. The uniqueness risk, and what the uniqueness risk is, you know, is unique as in I'm going after one large competitor. I don't really think about it that way. Who's going to not like it? And then is your strategy, and this is the hardest one of all, you know, is it future looking? We're really good at designing things for last year's market, right? And marketing to last year's need, but looking in the rearview mirror to decide our future thing. And that's probably one of the hardest things to think about when you're doing this work, is how future proof you are. And then you get into the earnings risk. Is there a profit pool, right? What's the source of earnings? Is it going away? You know, somebody told me one time, he goes, our biggest problem is none of our competitors are as interested in making money as we are. But that's an insight, right? Because you know that you're going to get disintermediated over earnings. So you have to think about that is, you know, I might be able to do the first 2 parts of this as well, but in the long run, I might not be able to sustain earnings because somebody's going to come in and take the value out of the market. That does happen. It does feel like this, right? So competitive impact, internal, the last 2 are the ones that are hard to do until recently. So internal gross margin risk, to actually know the true cost of what we're doing here, because I have seen 1 million people think they were successful, then they got the P&L for finance and like, what do you mean we're losing money, right? And then of course, there's the other cost risk, right? Tariffs, pandemic, supply chains, right? So all of these things can be assessed. The more data, the better, but point of views are good using your team. And the process is pretty straightforward. You can run this pre-launch, part of your annual planning. You assess the risk across the 15 factors, perhaps instruction your team to focus more in one area because you think that's which is fine. Then you analyze that risk. And what you do is you don't just say the ratings they give it. I'll show you how we do that. The ratings are right. You say, well, if everything that is high risk, you then examine the nature of that risk. And you ask people, you say, you guys all think it's a 5. Go bring us proof that it is a 5 on the risk scale, right? And it's not just your opinion, because it's easy to see risk everywhere, right? So can you bring us, can we either validate the risk is real with something other than our opinions? Or can we go, you know, we always say that's a risk. Sales always say it's a risk, but there's really no evidence for that, right? So we lower that risk factor, right? Because what we're trying to do is get to what are the real risks? What are the things we really should react to? So you reassess once you've gone through that process of re-examining the source of risk, and then you get into your mitigation strategy, right? And the mitigation strategy is built on whatever you perceive to be the real risk, right? So we have a scorecard, right? So, and what I like about our scorecard is it's very easier for you to adapt it to the conditions of a market, right? But across the 15, great to do with your team, your cross-functional team, get the smartest people you know together and tell them, you go through, add it all up, do very democratic, and then you work through it, the scorecard, and then it spits out an initial report that you can work through with your team. Yes, sir.
Ralph, on that previous slide, no, sorry, one more back. Where would you put sales cycle or timing risk? I see a forecast risk about the market growing slower, but it might not be market related. It might just be the sales cycle is slower than you thought of. Oh, sorry, longer than you thought it was gonna be.
Oh, so the time for upfront time for adoption,
Yeah,
probably in the forecast risk, right? So,
that's what I thought, but that would seem more market based, and the market may grow what it was gonna grow, what you predicted, but it's just not, they can't absorb it as fast as you thought.
yeah, I mean, it's a hard thing. That's why I was interested about how you, I asked David the question earlier about how do you account for the unknowability of the rate of adoption in something new, right? I mean, that's a really tough one, right? There's a lot of .coms that would have made it if they just said, look, we'll do this in 5 years instead of 1, right? But I don't have an easy answer, but the idea behind this is that, well, you can at least know based on the data available to you, right? You can make at least try to take a database guess based on what you know, right? From past experience, whatever. Don't just say, well, we don't know. That's all I'm saying. And that could be the biggest risk, right? The sales cycle won't go as fast as we think. Right? So, yeah.
Dr. Lillian taught us to use like a fast diffusion model and
Right.
past examples that maybe you can try to fit your more recent launches into one of those models, but typically it's really low innovation or high innovation,
Right.
and then low imitation or high imitation. So you know, with 4 or 5 curves that we pre-program into our NPV so that people sanity
Sure.
check.
Right.
And it's gonna be 5-7 years before this really takes off, but we're in a regulated industry, so.
Of course. And you know, the truth of the matter is, by the way, there's probably within the world of ISBM and all their experts, there's probably a really smart, you know, analytical way to actually answer all 15 of these questions, right? But we can't always apply those, right? So we start with that's like, that kind of thinking is what you happen when you say something's a 5 and nobody can take that off the table, then you might want to double down and look at something that's smarter to make that assessment. Yes, sir.
I'm sure we could come up with a couple of things that we could, and one that comes to my mind is culture. We heard culture eats strategy for breakfast, right?
Yeah.
And this is reflected somewhere, you know, in 15 elements.
Right. So yeah, so the cultural thing, I'm not sure how I can't really wrap that into this framework. And the reason why is we try to make this practical for a marketer managing a segment in a business to run. And the minute I drop, you know, something that heavy into it, the whole, you know, people's heads explode, right? So, yes, Luciana.
Maybe that ties back into the people risk that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, well, yeah, it definitely ties back to people, you know. Yeah, it was funny because I was thinking about, well, I mean, we said maybe think of this, but what you and I were talking about. I was looking at what Luciana said yesterday. If you remember, he put up like the 8 generally accepted mitigation strategies, right? And we actually have that in this framework. I'm not going to go into it today. And I hadn't looked at it this way in a while, but after listening to JT and after listening to Luciano, I was sitting there going like the first 3, which are basically to avoid the risk or to minimize risk. The first 3, I said, man, that's like leadership crack, because the first 3 are super easy choices. If you go look at the mitigation strategy, right? The next 5 actually require work, right? You know, partnership, sharing, all that stuff. And I thought to myself, like, there's a leadership bias that's going to drive them towards the first 3 choices in mitigation because, you know, oh, avoid it. That's a legitimate strategy. Perfect. We're done here, right? So that's why, you know, you want to narrow down the risk profile to manage to real risk and then say, this is doable. That's why I said this is doable. Right? And then get people to focus on where the real risk lies. Cultural risk notwithstanding, okay?
The other thing is over time. He mentioned the diffusion model, and there are a lot of those, but one of them is the chasm. You know, well, we're doing all this, and the first signals are green lights. We're blasting, and then all of a sudden everything stops.
Yeah.
So you know, predicting a chasm is an interesting.
That's a tough one.
That you know, the idea that are we getting a lot of early signals that are saying go go go, but are we really getting them from the piece of the market that we care about? Yeah, or are we going to sell to 2% of the market that loves it because it's new and that's it?
Well, the other, I don't think it's a shortcoming to this, but we would like to believe the world progresses in a linear fashion, right? And so And then we can apply this sort of in an order of priority, but the fact of the matter is the world doesn't necessarily proceed in an orderly fashion. And so maybe you can't, maybe you have to look backwards with this sometimes too, to make sure that your product market's not gonna go away, right, moving forward. So we go through and you do a scorecard, and what you end up with is you start out, usually when we've done this, you usually end up with, I would say on average, 4 or 5 factors that are rated 4 or higher by a team. And normally, again, not that I have normative data here, by the time you get done with the sort of the reassessment and the analysis, it comes down to 2 or 3 things, right? Because usually the risk is concentrated in one part of that framework, right? Either really, either in the market or the share or the earnings. And so now you can get down to the brass tacks on this, right? And then what you do is you go through and you talk about what's the value of the risk? Like how is that going to affect values, right? How do you measure the risk? And you can start to talk about mitigation strategies and move towards a final presentation. You can, when I do this for a particular client, I go in and customize the answers to that particular, use the same framework, but customize the answers to that particular industry because you want to try to make it as relevant as possible to them. But you can do that yourself, okay? You get done, and see in this case here, we ended up with 2 4s, and we began to trace out it's hard to see, I know, but I'll send you all this. What's the early stage mitigation strategy? And what you want to do is when we get done with this, and what we've done in the planning process is that all people present is that basically the output of their what they rated a high risk and why. And then they present the mitigation strategy for each risk, which is usually like 1 page. And the most important thing in the mitigation strategy is the measurement plan, which is I will know that this risk is starting to happen and we need to make an adjustment when this happens. And that's the really hard part of it. You don't have to be, because we also put in there a time horizon when we think if the risk happens, when is it likely to happen? Is it going to happen immediately, or is it going to happen a couple of years from now, or is it unknowable? But the strategy doesn't need to be terribly complex. The complexity of the strategy mitigation should reflect the potential value damage, right? So the bigger the financial risk, the more that mitigation strategy needs to be thought out, right? And pretty easy to do. And then when you present that as part of the planning cycle, you create this perception that not a perception that you said, like, we've taken on the idea that we're a risk, and we're trying to understand really where the risk is, what it means to the company, and how we would deal with it. Because risk happens, right? I look back at, I can't speak for the GE one. What happened with Bigfoot was completely predictable, right? If anybody had been honest with themselves about how that was going to affect the brand, so you were the first to say it, brand value, and that's why, to be honest with you, that's why the whole Western division didn't want to do it. They said, this is going to kill the brand. We just launched this brand in the West. People they think of us as the premium delivery pizza, and we're now going to sell them this piece of cheese on a piece of cardboard, right? And spend, I think it was $25,000 an oven per restaurant kind of thing. It was disaster, right? It was no. Yeah, and if somebody would, if not for all the leadership bias, it would have never happened. It would have been fine. Right? So I don't know about the GE one. So marketers who manage risk, the way I look at it, they reduce risk, they lead better, and they drive better decisions, right? And that's really what you want. You don't want to be at the meeting I was at, right? I wanted everybody to get up and say, that was great, here's your budget. Thank you, Ralph. You're a great leader. I feel very comfortable spending all my money behind you. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but I could have made a difference that I didn't. I didn't know, but now I know, right? So you mitigate the risk, you get leadership support, and hopefully you get the resources you need to be a good marketer, because you can't eliminate risk. It's part of the game, right? But you can manage it. Now, the secret benefits of the marketing risk management process, and I'm right up against time here. I asked AI if we should use AI, okay, for managed risk process. If you look at this and go, hey, I could create AI agents around those 15 factors, right? Here's what AI told me. So I asked her, what are the risks of using an AI agent for market risk assessments? Well, the first one I love, hallucinated facts, stats, or competitive claims presented confidently. So AI will admit that it's overconfident. that it's got bias, right? And it says it, overconfidence, AI rarely flags its own uncertainty, uncertainty unless prompted, right? So you can see how you can, oh, I AI proof this thing, right? Well, AI is telling you like, don't ask me, man, I'm gonna lie too, right? I like training data skews towards dominant markets, demographics, missing risk specific to niche audiences or underrepresented groups. In other words, it's gonna go for the lowest common denominator, right? The homogenization of the value proposition, right? And over there tends toward generic pattern match risk lists rather than insight specific to your situation. So I like the honesty of AI in this case, right? Because the fact of the matter is judgment never goes away. Your ability to judge talent, your ability to understand the biases that are in the process that you manage, right? And then your ability to interpret from factual information, everything, what is actually risky and what is not risky, right? There's another benefit to this, okay? That might be almost better than everything I just talked about. Everybody that I have seen take a team through this has seen opportunities to improve their strategy, right? Regardless of the risk, okay? And they've learned things about the quality of the thinking and the talent they have by leading them through this process and seeing how they think. And I've had many people come to me and say, that was the best part of it, right? Yeah, we made a better presentation of leadership, but I learned something that's going to help allow me to be a better marketer and a better leader of my team and help them develop, because I saw where they struggled with the strategy, right? That kind of thing. And then last is free and worth the price, okay? Which is, if you write to me, right there, talk to me, I will give you the entire process. I will give you the worksheets, I'll give you the framework, and you can take it and run this, because you should hire. One thing I will say about this, if you decide to do this on your own, right, and you absolutely can. It's just willpower. It's not, you don't need consultants, you don't need money. Just want to do it, right? It's part of your discipline. Have somebody objective in your company review it with you, because you need, I said it out loud when David was talking, you need someone has no vested interest in what you're doing to call BS on, right? Because the hardest thing to do is eliminate bias. And anytime you're doing the beliefs and the judgment, there's bias at work there, right? So sometimes it's good to have that. So I think David kind of plays that role with some of your teams, like, okay, guys, let's be honest about this. And you need that outside person, because if you only do it with your team, you guys are going to get excited about the work and you're going to feel like you've got an insight, and somebody else kind of needs to say, okay, that's interesting, but how do you know that, right? So that's my one suggestion to you. Find somebody in the organization that, and they don't even have to know marketing or anything else, just somebody that can, smart person. Does that make sense?
In some cases, that's one of the things, the silos inside the organizational barriers to doing that. Says, well, why are there no people from R&D here? Well, we're a marketing team. So, or why isn't there someone here from manufacturing? Well, why isn't there someone here that says, well, they don't know what I said, that's exactly right. They don't know. Now, they have no vested interest in this. Who's going to call bullshit better than someone who has, well, I can call bullshit and leave to fight another day.
Or just say, I don't understand why you.
Well, but I mean, I think that seems very valid to bring someone in from outside, a great consultant helping you with this. But even having the cross checks inside, you have to cut across silos, which are sometimes just so rigid that people don't understand it. It's true.
Yeah, so it's I welcome you to try it and see what happens and let us know. Any questions?